Well, it's 3 o'clock, and I think we can get started. Uh, Welcome, everybody. Thank you so very much for attending this demo. My name is Mark Miklos, and I'm the designer of GMT's Battles of the American Revolution series. Joining me in this demo today is my friend and vassal designer, Rob Doan. Rob and I are going to, when we get to that part of today's session, Rob and I are going to play through several turns of Rhode Island to give you a sense of how the Battles of the American Revolution plays. Rob has designed all of the BOAR modules that are on Vassal, and he's also GMing the current BPA play by email BOAR tournament, which is in its quarterfinal round as we speak. So we're grateful to have Rob with us. Let me tell you a little bit about how we're going to spend the next 2 hours. I want to start with just a brief overview of the BOAR series. The BOAR series has been around for 23 years, and I'm gambling that some folks on this demo today are not that familiar with it. So I want to just share a little bit about that history. Then we're going to talk about the core game system. That's those rules which are common across the entirety of the system, making it very easy to pick up a one game, learn it, and then flow with minimal effort into any other game in the system. Then we're going to briefly talk about some of the Chrome and some of the innovations within the series over the years. And then we'll hop right into the demo. The demo will be a two-part demo. We're going to be demoing the Battle of Rhode Island, which is volume 9 in the series. And we're going to demo a few turns at the beginning of that scenario and then sort of leapfrog into some of the later turns where we have a preset battle line where we'll be able to show you some of the way the phases of the game interact. And then before we wrap, we're going to take a sneak peek at White Plains. The Battle of White Plains is on P500 right now. As a matter of fact, as of 2 o'clock Eastern time this afternoon, we are just 6 games short of 500, and that's very, very exciting. Most of the elements of the game are art department ready already. The Battle of White Plains is definitely a story that needs to be told. And when we get to that part of today's session, we'll talk about White Plains in its place in history. And I want to use that particular part of today's session to talk about some of the challenges that occur when you are trying to design a operational level American Revolutionary War game and how we overcome some of those challenges. Because it's a chock full agenda and it will take us probably the entire 2 hours, I'm going to ask you to do two things for me. There's a chat feature in Discord, and if you would, if you have a question along the way, you can send it in as a chat. Rob Doan is going to be monitoring the chat room, and he'll answer as many of those questions as he feels he can, and will pose the others to me. And I'm also going to open it up to Q&A for about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the 2 hour session. So there will be an opportunity for us to chat at that time. So what about BOAR in the last 23 years? Well, the first game in the series, the Battle of Saratoga, was published in 1998. I started the design work on that game in 1996 after a visit to the Saratoga battlefield. And, you know, I had been wargaming probably for, oh, goodness gracious, over 20 years by then. And when you do anything for that long, you sort of feel like maybe you can try your hand at it. I probably innovated a couple of house rules for some of the classic games back in the 70s and 80s. And just felt like maybe I could do this too. But you know, you can't just jump in the ocean if you're a minnow. I looked around and said, what, you know, if I'm going to try this, what in the world would I do? There are so many tremendous, talented designers out there doing great games on popular subject matter. Does the world really need another Gettysburg, Battle of the Bulge, Waterloo game? And if so, I'm not the man to do it, because who would gamble on a newbie designer when there's so many other excellent games on those topics out there. Back in the 90s and before the 90s, the Revolutionary War was underrepresented in the hobby, and there weren't very many games. And I felt like, well, all right, this is a niche that not too many people are working in. Saratoga is recognized by, I think, all historians as one of the 10 or 12 most decisive battles of world history, because, of course, it meant that we were going to be guaranteed French intervention, and French intervention enabled us to win the revolution. And so uh, Saratoga seemed the logical play, and the revolution seemed the logical theme. And in 1998, we were only 5 years away from the 225th anniversary of independence. And I felt like if I could design a Revolutionary War game and catch that wave, it would be an opportunity to take advantage of the consciousness raising that was going to be occurring across the country, especially in the East, as we approached that anniversary. I took 2 years to design it. I shopped it around. I got a lot of polite rejections, and then thankfully GMT, Andy Lewis, and Gene Billingsley were willing to take a chance on me. Um, we were very fortunate. We were runner-up for the Charles Roberts Award that year for Best Pre-World War II Game, and I think we did win the Charles Roberts for Best Board Game Graphics. That was in 1998. And with Saratoga and its success, a series was born. We have, as I say, 9 published titles. Within those 9 titles are 13 distinct battles and 28 scenarios. So there's a very broad palette of American Revolutionary War gaming experience that you have at your fingertips. Some of these are well known. The Battle of Saratoga, Brandywine Creek, Guilford Courthouse, Monmouth Courthouse, and Germantown. Those are all names that most people are familiar with. Others less so. Eutaw Springs, the Battle of Savannah, the Battle of Pensacola, the Battle of Newtown, in which an army, a legitimate army of Iroquois warriors, stood toe to toe with elements of the Continental Army, the one and only time it happened in the entire Revolutionary War. The Battle of Oriskany, even the Battle of Rhode Island that you're looking at on the screen here. We'll talk about that in a second. Back in the day, I was a history teacher, and I hope I could be excused for feeling motivated to not only design entertaining and challenging games, but to use the medium of gameplay to teach this vital period in American history. And before we talk about the core system, one last point about my selection of titles within the series. I already pointed out that some of these are not as well known. A great example of that, the Battle of Pensacola. Consider that Florida was not even one of the 13 colonies. And at the Battle of Pensacola, you have a Spanish army supplemented by French fighting the British, who were in possession of Pensacola at the time. The only Americans on the battlefield were 2 battalions of loyalist infantry fighting for the British, one from Maryland, one from Pennsylvania. And yet the Battle of Pensacola is critical to the story of the Revolution and to the opening up of the West to American expansion after the war. So again, sort of trying to find that balance between popular, well-known titles and ones that are perhaps less well-known but equally important. So now let's talk about the core system, the core game system. This, as you can see on the screen, is a hex encounter game, and the fundamentals of hex encounter play, I think, are going to be familiar to anyone with even limited war game experience. Concepts like strength points, movement points, stacking limits or stacking restrictions, zones of control, line of sight for ranged weapons, and terrain effects are all standard elements in the core system. The scale here is battalion and regimental level primarily, with each strength point equaling approximately 100 men. Each strength point of artillery represents 2 guns, and each hexagon is 200 yards across. So it's about 8 hexes to a mile, and most of the battle maps are in the order of 3 to 4 miles by 2.5 to 3 miles, something along those lines. I try to create a core system that would be simple enough and accessible enough to brand new players. And indeed, some of the titles in my series and scenarios within those titles have low counter density and straightforward tactical situations, which make themselves very suitable for introducing new players. Utah Springs comes to mind after, about 20 years of competitive play at WBC and PresCon and elsewhere, and we've kept records of all these tournament results. I could tell you that 1/3 of all of those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tournament games, 1/3 of them have been British victories, 1/3 American victories, and 1/3 have been draw. So that's pretty good, and that's a great scenario to introduce new players on. But I not only wanted a simple system, I wanted one that was nuanced enough to be challenging to the experienced player, and I think we've hit that balance with the BOAR system. We've got some really great players that are devoted fans of the series, several of whom are on this call here today, and are dedicated tournament players, area-rated players who keep coming back for more because the challenges posed in these battles and scenarios, I think, are very elegant and challenging enough for the experienced player. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of other elements in the core system. If you're a Hex Encounter player, you probably are familiar with the term soak-off. I've never liked the concept of soak-off, where you have to make an ill-advised, horrible odds attack on the end of a line somewhere so that you can concentrate forces elsewhere. I just felt like that was unreasonable. And so we introduced a concept called diversion. During every combat phase, you get a single diversion opportunity anywhere that you want it on the battlefield. Instead of having to soak off at disadvantageous odds, you can throw those units in on an adjacent combat in exchange for taking a column shift on that adjacent combat. The combat results table, and I don't know, Rob, can you go to charts and tables and pull up the combat results table? Is that possible?
Yep, absolutely.
While Rob is pulling that up, I want to point out that the combat results table is non-sanguine.
Rob, you'll need to, pardon me, Mark, Rob, you'll need to scope in a little bit. It's very hard to read.
Yeah, I can't on the charts window, unfortunately.
Okay, well,
this is as good as
in any case, you can take my word for it. Even squinting at that chart, you can see there are letters like D and R and the word pin, and very few numbers like 1 and 2. The numbers reflect step losses. R is retreat, D is disrupt, pin is pinned. In this period, battles were won most often by breaking the will of your opponent to fight. And we're going to talk in a moment about army morale and unit morale. With few exceptions, battlefield casualties were not enormous. Bunker Hill comes to mind, Savannah comes to mind as examples of high casualty engagements, but for the most part, not. And so I wanted a combat results table that would create tension and friction without historical casualty rates that deplete one side or another before you know it. Another thing about, you can close that window, Rob, thank you. Another thing about the core system, this is not an I go, you go game. This is not chess. This is not, the fiction of, that your opponent is going to go next after you're done. That's guaranteed. And you, knowing that that's guaranteed, you make a certain move. You don't have that certainty in Battles of the American Revolution. It is entirely possible for a player to get a back-to-back move determined by the roll of an initiative die roll, and that initiative can be influenced by the status of your army morale. If you're in high morale, you're more likely to maintain initiative. If your army is fatiguing, less likely, and if your army is wavering, it's unlikely that you'll get the initiative. And we're going to talk about momentum in a second. You have resources called momentum. You can even spend momentum in an effort to influence initiative to try to get that back-to-back move. A back-to-back move at the right moment can be decisive. It can be devastating. And when you're maneuvering, you have to always be aware of whether or not your opponent is poised for that back-to-back move.
Hey, Mark, sorry, can I interrupt for just a second?
Yes,
because we have a question you might want to field here from Harold. Okay. But he's asking, have you ever considered battles on the French and Indian War or the War of 1812?
I have, and that's been asked a lot over the years. Harold, thanks for the question. I think the system would lend itself very well in either direction historically, but until I deplete the wealth of experiences in the revolution that I still want to model, I think we'll let it rest here, at least for the time being. I mentioned momentum. Momentum is a resource. It's represented by a momentum chit. There are 5 in every game, 5 chits. Typically, one side or the other starts with 1 chit of momentum, not always. And momentum can be used in several ways. If you're in close combat and you get an adverse combat result, you can spend that momentum to force a reroll of the combat die. You can, as I said a second ago, spend momentum to try to influence the initiative die roll if you're anxious for the back-to-back move. And in some games that have opportunity cards, you can spend momentum to purchase additional cards into your hand. We're going to, when we get to the demo, we're going to actually demonstrate a lot of these elements of the game that I'm describing now in general terms. The game within the game of the BOAR system is the interplay between individual unit morale and a player's overall army morale at any given time. Army morale is measured on a sliding scale, and I think, Rob, if you can track down to the army morale track on this map and possibly enlarge it. There we go. Even if you can't, oh yes, good. You will be able to enlarge it. So there you have the army morale track. To the right in the light shading is the high morale status. You see that's where the game begins. In this case, the American Army with slightly higher morale. In the middle range, the armies are fatigued. Unit morales are depleted when you're in fatigue status, and your initiative is a little harder to get. You can also go all the way down to a wavering status, and should you become demoralized, the game ends immediately, regardless of the tactical situation on the battlefield. Again, battles more often were won in this period by breaking the will of the enemy to fight. And so this is the game within the game, and you're really playing 2 games at once. You have to be mindful of the tactical situation on the board and what you're trying to accomplish there, while ensuring that you maintain superior morale over your opponent. Once one army becomes fatigued, and looking at this scale, I'm not talking about if you drop down to 14 or even 13, but if you drop down to, say, 8 or 9, it's very difficult to climb back out of that, particularly if your opponent is maintaining high morale. So it can become a slippery slope that can undo the best laid plans. That is truly the game within the game. And the last thing I'll say about the core system is that games can be won decisively, substantially, or marginally. A decisive victory is usually linked to certain terrain objectives or casualty thresholds. And by design, decisive victory is very hard to achieve in battles of the American Revolution games. There were very few decisive victories in the Revolution. Substantial victory occurs when you demoralize your enemy. When you drive this morale track to zero, you have won a substantial victory. Failing either of those two levels of victory, you play the game out through the last game turn and compare victory points that have been accumulated throughout the game for casualties, or in some cases for terrain objectives, leader losses, and so on. And then if your margin of points fulfills a stipulated range for that scenario, then you have won a marginal victory. Now, let's face it, if you have your buddy over at the house and you're playing at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, these levels of victory, so-called, don't matter all that much. You're playing for fun, you're playing to win. But in tournament play, these levels of victory are very, very important because they influence the accumulation of tournament points, which are used to derive seeding and pairing as the tournaments progress through subsequent rounds. I know not everybody's a tournament player, but a lot of people that play BOAR get hooked on the tournament experience. And so, again, these levels of victory come into play. All right, let's talk now about, and I think we're doing great on time here. We're only at 20 minutes in, so I'm very pleased with the pacing. Let's talk a little bit about the chrome, so to speak, the things that make different games unique. I'm not going to go through all nine volumes, and within those 9 volumes, all 12 battles, and within those 12 battles, all 28 scenarios to talk about every little piece of chrome. But I want to give you a couple of examples just so you have a sense of how we try to put fingerprints on each game to make it unique. Let's take Eutaw Springs, for example. At the Battle of Eutaw Springs, the Americans initially caught the British napping. They were literally at breakfast and just waking up. It was a surprise attack. It was initially successful. The Americans broke the British line, and as the British fell back, the Americans swarmed into the British encampment. I should say that Eutaw Springs is about 32 to 35 miles northeast of Charleston, South Carolina, and this is already late in the war after Nathaniel Greene is campaigning to reconquer South Carolina. Cornwallis has already gone to Virginia by this point. So the Americans surprise attack, they sweep into the camp, and as soon as they do, of course, the cook fires are going, and there's rum in the kegs, and there's shoes, and there's muskets, and there's bayonets, and there's everything the Continentals don't have and need. And so, with only a couple of exceptions, the Army broke ranks and began to loot the camp. And historically, this gave the British time to regroup and counterattack. And by the time they counterattacked, several of these Americans were in their cups. They got to the rum and they were having a good time. And so the British counterattack was successful. It pushed the Americans back out of the camp. And at the end of the day, the British held the battlefield. By 18th century standards, that constituted victory, although it was another one of those Pyrrhic victories because the Americans could, as Nathaniel Greene said, get beat, rise up, and fight again. And the British, of course, could not support even a few casualties at this point in the war. So we have looting. It's the only game that has looting, but it gives you that special opportunity to experience what that might have been like. And you may say, well, I just won't go in the camp. Well, the camp's worth 3 victory points. It starts British control. And so if you don't take the camp as the American player, it's a harder row to hoe to try to achieve victory. So it's an objective, but yet when you get in there, there's an opportunity that you'll break ranks to loot, and your officers will be going crazy trying to rally the guys. So that's one example from Eutaw Springs. Let's talk about Monmouth Courthouse. During the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, it was the hottest day in recorded weather history in New Jersey. I don't know if that record holds to this very day. It may not. anymore, but it was so hot that more men fell out on both sides from heat stroke and heat exhaustion than from battlefield casualties. And so to reflect that which was special that day at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, we have heat game turns that occur from about 11 in the morning, I guess, I think it is, if memory serves, right on up to about 4 or 5 p.m. And during heat game turns, rally is more difficult. If you're rolling for initiative and the die roll is tied, the entire game turn is skipped. Everybody sat under a tree somewhere, unbuttoned their collar, and tried to rest and recuperate, is what that is basically reflecting. And there are certain Hessian units that won't even move in the game without a pre-movement morale check. And that's every single game turn. You have to roll for them, and if they pass their morale, they will move for that turn only, and they have to check again. And that goes on until they actually engage in combat. But they start toward the rear, and most times those units, because of this mechanic, don't even get into the fight. And one more thing about Monmouth, the thing that is maybe the most interesting bit of chrome in that battle, there are command and the American Army experienced command and control breakdown within the vanguard units. Major General Charles Lee was given command of the vanguard. At first, he didn't want it because he didn't believe in the mission. But when Washington offered it to Lafayette, who was a subordinate commander, Lee's honor was offended, and he said, "No, I'm the Army's second in command. I deserve to command the vanguard." So he took command, but his heart wasn't in it. And throughout the opening phase of the Battle of Monmouth, there were contradictory orders. Individual regimental commanders ended up doing their own thing. It's possible to not move at all. It's possible to not have strategic movement, which is the opportunity to double your movement points on a road. It's possible to refuse to move at all, or in some cases, you might even end up countermarching off the map. And all the while that this command and control breakdown is befuddling the American player, the British player is swarming onto the board with one of the two British divisions. And those are crack units for the most part, and there's a lot of pressure on the American Army early. Well, General Washington shows up around mid-game, fires Lee in the saddle, takes personal command of the battlefield, and stabilizes the situation. So again, the breakdown of command is a chrome rule that occurs in Monmouth so that we can experience what that must have been like. I'll give you just two more examples of chrome, and then I think we'll be close to time for our demo. At Germantown, Washington wanted to converge on Germantown with 3 columns. It was an ambitious maneuver given the limitations of communication at the time. What made it worse, it was foggy, densely foggy actually, for several hours, then moderately foggy, and then finally the fog lifted. And to make matters worse, while the American Army was creeping forward in the fog, we have General Adam Stephen, much to his undying shame, drunk on duty and giving conflicting, contradictory, convoluted orders to his division. And as a result, Stephen's division moves by random die roll, depending on what turn of the game it is. That will determine which directions potentially he can move in. And if Stephen's units bump into friendly American units in the fog, there's an opportunity for a friendly fire incident. This actually happened, and units in the American Army that were fired upon by their own men from behind panicked and pulled out of line, and that opened up a gaping hole for the British to exploit. And we have this mechanic in Germantown where Adam Stevens' men are wandering around in the fog, and they may or may not bump into friendly units. If they do, you check for friendly fire. It's not a given that it'll happen, but it's possible. It's likely, actually. And then, assuming that it happens, panic can spread up and down the line from the point of contact, opening up this gaping hole for the British to exploit. So that's another example of a Chrome rule that occurs in Germantown. And here we're looking at the Newport side of the Battle of Rhode Island game. In this battle, which I'll talk about shortly, we have French units. There are Chrome rules that prohibit cooperation between the French and the Americans. They are allies. They have a common enemy, but they're not. They don't play well in the sandbox. The only exception is the Marquis de Lafayette, who is attached to the French column with a few American units under his command, and those are the only American forces that can cooperate, provided that Lafayette is commanding. We also have rules for siege artillery and mortars in this game. And then if you could zoom in on the bog, I just want to talk about the bog for a quick second. Another example of Chrome in this game. You see the bog there on Bailey's Creek, where Bailey's Creek empties into Easton Pond. The British commander was concerned for his right flank, and so he dammed up Bailey's Brook. You can see the dam depicted on the map there. And the idea was to flood the lowland there. And so you see the swampy type terrain effect symbols in those hexes there. And think of what the Dutch did in World War II to slow the Germans down. Same idea. We're going to flood the lowland, create a bog, and provide more security for our right flank. Well, for reasons I'm going to explain in a moment, this battle, although it came within a mere couple of hours of occurring, never did actually occur. So the bog was never tested historically. We have contradictory evidence in the narrative about how effective it was likely to be. The British High Command felt the bog was going to be very effective. The chief British engineer officer, however, wrote in his diary that he was skeptical about how effective the bog would be. And so we have a bog transit table. The American player, one time in the game, gets to test the bog to see how playable it is. And we have the lowest odds of extreme outcomes. So the lowest odds of completely impassable or completely passable, and better odds for being somewhat passable with certain restrictions. And so that, I think, gives us a chance to, again, model with variability from game to game what this might have looked like. And then, although we're not going to turn the map over just yet, on the other side of this map is the Rhode Island scenario proper, the Battle of Rhode Island historical scenario. And in that game, we have not only opportunity card play, which is another little bit of Chrome, but we have a British naval squadron that can actually conduct offshore bombardment. So thinking back to where we were about 15 minutes ago in the discussion, we were talking about the basic hex encounter core system that should feel like and be familiar to anybody that's played a war game. But then each game offers these unique elements of Chrome that puts you in the moment and lets you relive the specifics of any given battle in the series. And the games come with a series rule book, which is the same in every volume, and then the so-called exclusive rule book, which is typically 4 or 5 pages of Chrome, plus a historical commentary, designer notes, and order of battle. The last thing I want to cover before we jump into the demo is that we not only have a core system, and we not only have grafted Chrome onto the individual games, but we've innovated some new and different modalities over the years. For example, we've introduced siege warfare in 2 of our volumes, the Battle of Savannah and the Battle of Pensacola. We introduced card-assisted play. This is not a CDG. This is not a card-driven game system, but we have what are called either in some games random events cards and in other games opportunity cards, which introduce additional layers of nuanced history and how those specific events may have influenced a moment on the battlefield. Nothing that's decisive enough to alter a game, but a lot there to enhance a game. And we'll show you some of those opportunity cards in the demo. The Battle of Newtown, I want to say a word or two more about that. I mentioned it when I said it was the only time that the Iroquois fought as an army, literally, with a few non-native troops in support. It was fought outside of what is modern-day Elmira, New York, in upstate New York. The Battle of Newtown was basically 10 years in design. I had the idea of doing it. Actually, a dear friend of this con and a designer, a renowned designer known to probably everybody on this call today, Volko Runka, and I had a conversation some years ago, and he and his son had visited the Newtown battlefield, and
sorry, Mark, I'm just bringing it up for you here. It's on screen.
Oh yeah, beautiful. Thank you. He talked to me about it, and he intrigued me so much that I followed up and went there myself, and I really started to dig into this notion of how an army, quote unquote, of Native Americans who don't fight like soldiers but fight like warriors, and there's a difference. How they might have engaged this conventional army, this continental army. This is 1/3 of the Continental Army, commanded by John Sullivan, that was dispatched to Iroquois to once and for all defeat the Iroquois and subdue Iroquois to take the pressure off the western frontiers. And so the Indian player, for the Indian player, I designed an asymmetrical series of rules that you, for example, the Indian player, the player of the game, I should say, does not get to decide in which order the native troops are going to move. You'll see the native troops have color banding: yellow, green, light green, orange, brown, and so on. Each of those are the different tribes, and within some of the larger tribes, there's totems: Turtle Clan, Wolf Clan, and so on. These are all distinct warrior groups who move and fight as it pleases them based on the circumstances they find themselves in. The Iroquois player has complete control and authority over his non-native troops. Butler's Rangers, the Mohawk Valley Militia, those are conventional forces, and you move them first without knowing whether the natives you're banking on to support that move are going to move, or if they are going to move, will they move in support, or will they go off on a tangent somewhere? Now, of course, offsetting some of that uncertainty are a lot of capabilities that the native warriors have. They can retreat before combat if they find themselves in an adverse situation. They can infiltrate through the woods. They have a ferocity component. They have an honor component. You determine which tribal group has honor at the start of the game, and that's a resource that can float between the different tribal groups depending on how they're performing as the game goes on, and so on. So they have unique capabilities that makes them very potent, but at the same time, the player has limited control over them as it would compare to playing the American side, which is very conventional. It's your turn to move. You move your guys. You move them where you want them. You fight in the order you want to fight, and so forth. So 10 years in design, and this game got high praise from the College of Strategic Studies at the Defense Intelligence University for its portrayal of asymmetrical warfare. The last one that I want to mention is the Battle of Savannah. I want to go back to that one too and mention it because that one I designed intentionally to be a 3-player game. There was a lot of conversation last night on GMT night about solitaire play, and I know that's very popular now and becoming more so all the time. I don't know how many games, and of course there's plenty of multiplayer games. I don't know how many operational level war games there are out there that were designed intentionally to be 3-player games where only 1 player can win. And so what you have here, it's another situation with the French and the Americans allied against the British. Well, this is Comte d'Estaing, and he's a prickly individual, and there was a lot of dispute over precedence and formality and honor and who should have the right to request terms from the British and who should have the right to conduct the main attack and so forth and so forth. And I wanted to compel the Allied players, the American and the French players, I wanted to compel them to feel that tension and that friction. And so in this game, keeping in mind that only 1 player can win it, the Allies have to share all the resources. They have to share the random events cards. They have to share momentum. They have to share that diversion opportunity on the battlefield. There's only 1 opportunity for a diversion per game turn. So if the French player wants a diversion and the American player likewise wants a diversion, there's only 1 diversion, guys. Figure it out, okay? Momentum. Typically, you're holding a single momentum chit. You can gain more momentum, and that's a good thing when you do. But for argument's sake, let's say you're holding 1 momentum chit, and each of you want it. Who's going to get it? How are you going to decide? I intentionally did not write a lot of restrictive rules around how to share resources. I wanted the players to simply figure it out and, of course, disagree as often as they agree. And what that's led to, not in friendly games, again, so much, but in tournament play over the years, that has led to some really interesting situations and, frankly, even to some acrimony at the table between Allied players, because everybody wants to win the wood at WBC, and let's say the British player's being beaten, but only the French or the American player can win based on points and precedent and so forth. So precedence, and so selecting down the wire, the order of play and how to use those resources becomes critical to one side or the other winning the game, and it leads to that element of friction that was there in reality, and I think anybody who's played Savannah 3-player can tell you that it's a really cool experience to be put through that sort of a model. All right. Well, with all that being said, I think in summary, you can see that the BOAR series over 23 years is continually evolving to offer a fresh game experience with each new volume without straying from its original core system. And I think, at least in part, that has been a secret to its success and longevity. So with that, and we have lots of time, we were only 45 minutes in, let's go ahead and set up the first part of our demo. We're going to be demoing the Battle of Rhode Island. Now, this is the flip side of that Newport map that you've been looking at. To set the stage for this demo, I'll tell you that when the French signed the Treaty of Alliance in February of 1778 and sent an expeditionary force of 16 ships, capital ships, and 4,000 troops, it was here to Newport, Rhode Island that they sailed. It was not their first objective, but circumstances led them to come here. And this was going to be the very first time that the French and the Americans were going to cooperate in the war. And I want to emphasize the date. This is the 29th of August, 1778. And what happened just 11 months earlier, 12 months earlier, in September and October of 1777? General Burgoyne's British army surrendered at Saratoga to Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. That surrender, the loss of an entire British army, brought the French into the war. What might have happened, my friends, if a second British army had been captured en masse just 1 year later? I argue that this had the potential to end the American Revolution 5 years sooner than it actually ended. And if you remember the Newport map, we were just looking at it. You saw this, the city of Newport defended by the British. You have the French and the Americans deployed around the outer rim of the map. And we know the battle plan. We know the which American divisions were where. We know where the French were going to come in. I already told you Lafayette was assigned to them. We know that the British were deployed in 2 lines of defenses: earthworks, abattis, redoubts, trenches. They had lots and lots of artillery. They brought their artillery off of their ships before they scuttled them. And so it was a pretty strong position. But the American army is within just a couple digits of being 3 times as large. Now, that American army is made up of a big chunk of militia, and let's face it, militia, were not that reliable. But there were also quality units there. There were Continental units trained at Valley Forge that had fought at Monmouth and had, elite status. And there were a couple of crack units as well here. And there were state troops, which are pretty good quality units in their own right. And there was a contingent of about 1,500 volunteer units, not militia, not state troops, but volunteers, well-equipped, well-led, well-financed, brilliantly uniformed, that were in this American array. We have the battle plan. We know where everybody's supposed to be. The French are ashore. We're within a couple of hours of launching the grand assault when a lookout spots the arrival of a British reinforcing fleet coming over the horizon. Admiral d'Estaing decides he dare not get bottled up in Narragansett Bay, so he re-embarks his expeditionary force, sorties his fleet, and sails out to engage the arriving British fleet. Well, that's okay. General Sullivan, commanding the Americans, begins to dig siege approaches, place his siege guns, his 13 and 15-inch mortars, and so on. In classic 18th century line of battle, the French and the British fleets engage, and while they're engaging, and the French have the weather gauge, by the way, which means they have the advantage. While they're engaging, a nor'easter blows up. A lot of authors call it an outright hurricane. Some of the period authors referred to it as a nor'easter. It lasted 3 days, and it not only scattered, but it decimated both fleets. Admiral d'Estaing's own flagship, the Languedoc, was completely dismasted. 10 days later, after they sortied on the 10th of August, 10 days later, on the 20th of August, a few French ships limped back into Narragansett Bay and announced to the Americans that the French fleet is battered, in no shape to continue the campaign. They're going to Boston to refit, after which they're going to the Caribbean to protect the Sugar Islands, which was always the French nation's primary objective. And so once that was made known, the American army began to melt away. The volunteer troops left. The militia went home. Some of the state troops left. And suddenly Sullivan had, forget about assaulting Newport, he barely had enough men left to maintain the siege. And so on the night of the 28th, He lit all his campfires to deceive the enemy. Rob, you can go ahead and flip the map back over if you would. He lit campfires to deceive the enemy and pulled out of the lines, racing northward. To your left on this map is north. To your right at the map edge, yes, Rob is scanning toward the north. Thank you. If you scan back in the other direction, Rob, this map edge, it does not perfectly wed to the corresponding edge on Newport. There's about a 4 or 5 hex gap, but essentially this map, except for that half mile or so, this map takes over where the other map left off. And the American forces are retreating, and they're retreating up to the ferry crossings at the north end of the island so they can get over to the mainland. And you see the American army drawn up in line. Yes, that's the road to the ferry crossing at Howland's Ferry. And Rob, if you can scroll back down the map, here we see the main American line drawn up from shore to shore, about 2 miles across the island, to screen the baggage, the camp followers, the cattle, the heavy guns, all the flotsam and jetsam of the army that has to get to safety. And scrolling now to our right, you see the rear guard of the American Army, a couple of formations. The one at the top of your screen is Colonel Livingston. He's commanding one of the rear guard on the East Road. And if you'll scroll in the other direction, Rob, here you have Colonel Lawrence with a smaller formation, rear guard screening the West Road. When dawn broke and the British saw that the Americans had left their lines, the commander, General the Baronet Pigot, ordered pursuit. The green units are Hessians. They are out in pursuit coming up the West Road when the game begins. And on the top of the map, you have the Redcoats under Brigadier Smith coming up the East Road, also in pursuit. And this is how the game begins. The British player has the initiative on turn 1. That is preset, so we know the British player will move first. After game turn 1, player order is random, as I was describing in the core system. The other thing that you will not see on this map is that the British don't know what's in front of them, and so in live gameplay, the American units would be masked. And they're only unmasked when they're engaged. So the British player has to sort of feel his way forward. Now, when the game starts and you know the initial deployment, you kind of know where everything is, obviously. But 2 or 3 or 4 turns into the game, as the American player is maneuvering and changing his stacks and stuff, you kind of can lose track of what's where, and that lack of intelligence does come into play. But for the sake of a cleaner demo, we're not going to mask the units. So Rob, I think with that, we're probably ready to start play. I'm going to jump over to my Vassal screen here.
Okay.
And I think if I understand correctly, the players can see
yeah, so just to...
When you play a tactic or something, they're going to see everything you do, but mine will be masked.
Right, yeah. So, yeah, everybody, you're looking at my screen. I'm signed in as the American player here. So when we get to that, when we get to selecting tactics, I'll kind of explain that, but we can kind of move up to that point if you want to.
All right. So the game begins with determining initiative, and as I said, we know that the British player has initiative when the game begins. So the next phase in the sequence is the movement phase. Units that begin on a road, remain on a road, and never come adjacent to an enemy can move by strategic movement, which is a doubling of their movement rate. If you look at any of the units, Rob, if you'll hover over any of the units so your folks can see, the large number on the bottom right of a combat unit is its movement. So starting up here with the British Light Infantry with a movement of 4, they're going to go 1/2 1, 1/2 2, 1/2 3, and I'm going to stop there at 3.5. Stacking is 6 strength points, and stacking is in effect at all times in the BOAR game system. It's in effect during friendly movement. It's in effect during retreat after combat. It's in effect at all times. If a unit cannot maneuver without a violation of stacking, you either have to take a step loss if that will allow you to stack and move, or the unit is captured outright. And that forces players to fight, to appreciate the linear tactics of lines of battle moving forward with intervals behind them before the supporting lines moved up, to allow units some maneuver room. So I'm going to take, let's see, this is the...
Hey, Mark, before you move, I'm holding a card that we had talked about that can't be held. Do you want to do that first?
Yes, thank you. For the folks on the call, when the game is set up and you're getting ready to play, thank you, Rob, you draw 2 opportunity cards into your hand from the deck at the start of play. And Rob and I have already done that in preparation for today. But my blood was up and I was ready to go.
I know.
So I forgot. So
in traditional Miklos fashion.
If you want to play a card, please do.
So if you're looking at the screen, you'll see here's my hand, the 2 cards that I've drawn. Mark has done the same, but you're only able to see what I'm holding since I'm sharing my screen. So the one on the left, if you look at this, and I know the quality might not be good enough to read it, so I will just read what this card says. First of all, the red text says this card may not be held, so that's why we're doing this. I've got to play this right away as soon as I draw it. But the name of the card is Dr. Tillotson's Flying Hospital, and it says to restore 1 American combat unit that's not adjacent to the enemy to full strength. Previously lost victory points, army morale, and casualty track points are not recovered and will be lost again if the unit is again reduced. If no American combat units qualify, discard and draw again. So what we had said, we wanted to show this because I've drawn this in the beginning here. Obviously, we have not had any combat yet. So since I've drawn this, I've got to go with that kind of last qualifier. I've got to discard and draw again since nobody's eligible. So I will do that. And that played that down there, so into the draw deck. So let me draw again, and let's see if I get... well, I've drawn another one that cannot be held. So this can happen in the game. So this time I've drawn a card. It's a quote from the Marquis de Lafayette. It says, replace Sullivan with his opportunity unit counterpart. If Sullivan's already a casualty, discard and draw again. So I'll play that. That's a very nice result for me. If this were a real game, I'd be pretty happy about that. So I'm going to go back here to Sullivan. Sullivan is sitting back here on the main American line. If you can see his counter there on the top. So I'm going to, in the physical game, there's another counter that you would go ahead and replace him with. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I don't know if you can tell, but the numbers here on the bottom of the counter, he basically gets a slightly better rating here for this opportunity card unit version of himself. He went from a 126 to a 226, and that first number is the one that went up. That's basically a die roll modifier in combat, so he's going to be better for me in combat now. Okay, now I think we're all set, Mark.
Okay, well, having reminded me about cards, I have a card I wish to play, and this is voluntary on my part. It's not required that I play it now, but I'm going to. If you look at the bottom of the map, you can see that I've played it to the map board. It's called Heavy Guns. It's my friendly movement phase, so I'm entitled to play this card now. I get to add heavy artillery and loyalist Tory militia from the opportunity box to my counter mix as reinforcements. And these units enter together at either entry hex B1 or B2. If this was the night turn, I would discard and draw again. So I'm going to come over to the opportunity units. I'm going to send the militia and the heavy guns to the reinforcement hex. And actually, I think I'm going to elect to, it took them to B1 automatically, but I'm going to choose to put them on hex B2 up here where the British forces are entering the game. So having played our cards, I think we're ready for me to continue my moving. So let me go ahead and come up 1, 2, 3.5. I'm going to stop there. The Grenadiers are going to move up and stack. Leaders always stack for free. 1, 2, 3.5. Artillery movement is only 3, and so doubled on the road would be 6. 1, 2, 3. And just one other quick point about stacking. I said 6 strength points is your stacking limit. That's 6 strength points of infantry or cavalry units. One gun of any value may stack for free on a stack. And so that's just the way artillery stacking is handled. All right, so I've avoided contact. I've moved up. I'm going to come down to the Hessians. I've got my crack von der Malsburg chasseurs. You'll notice that counter has a label LT, which stands for light infantry. Light infantry has a slightly better movement, as you would expect, and they're harder to hit with fire combat because they're in open formation. They're going to come straight up the gut and engage Talbot right there. I'm going to put him back just for one quick second. Let's see. 23, 27. I'm trying to find his space. Where was he?
Oh, here, I'll move him, Mark.
Thank you.
There he is.
Thank you. There he is. A moment ago, when I was using road movement, I was talking about you get to move half a movement point per road hex if you don't come adjacent. Normal movement on this unit is a value of 4. In order to close on an enemy, you have to be in your normal rate of movement. And so technically speaking, 1, 2, 3, and 4. This notion that you can't close on an enemy while using strategic movement is in the system to compel you to leave column and enter line of battle. And that transition from column to line takes time to execute. And so if you were coming from a far distance back, you would come up in column and you would get close to the enemy, but you would halt out of range, form line, and then close. All right, moving on up. 1/2 1, 1/2 2, 2.5. See, he could not go up in there because that would be 6 spaces, which would be in excess of his regular movement value. I've got guns here. It's 1, 2, 3. I'll bring the leader von Lossberg up, and von Second Anspach will trail. I've got the von Hein regiment down here. Now I have some 3 units at start whose movement values are in a white box. That's a visual cue to remind players that on the opening turn of the game, these units may not use strategic movement. They've already moved to this point when the game begins, and so we're only going to complete their movement with 4 more hexes. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3. And then my newly arrived reinforcements. Heavy artillery, you'll notice, only moves 2, but it has a range of 4 hexes, whereas the lighter field guns with the forward British force have a movement of 3, move a little faster, but their range is only 3. Remember, each hex is 200 yards. So we're talking about effective range for these weapon systems. 1/2 1, 1/2 2, and I think the militia, although it can outpace the guns, I'm going to elect to keep the militia with the guns. That's the end of the movement phase. The next phase is rally. If I had had any units from a previous game turn that were disrupted or shattered, I would have an opportunity now to rally them. If I was holding momentum, which I'm not when the game begins, my American opponent has the at-start momentum in this scenario, I could spend momentum now during the rally phase to buy an opportunity card if I wanted to. Neither of those circumstances apply. The next phase is defensive artillery fire. So now my opponent, who is not the phasing player, gets to fire defensive artillery with any artillery that's within range and line of sight.
So there is
Rob?
one such unit for the Americans here, which I just put up to the top of the stack, this Jackson's Battery A unit. And that's, if we go down to the bottom, you see the two on the bottom part of the screen are infantry. So he's the one that I have. So technically he does have a shot. I think, Mark, as you just said, the maximum range for artillery is 3. So he does have Mark's lead unit here, the light infantry, in range, theoretically. I'll open the charts. I know I don't think you're really going to be able to see this, but I'll tell you what I'm looking at. I have 1 strength point with this artillery unit. So if you look at the top of this chart, 1 strength point firing at a range of either 2 or 3 hexes, which is what the range is here, you need a 9 to hit. So on a 10-sided die, just that 10% chance. The problem for me is my target unit is the light infantry. And if you're able to look on the chart and see the modifiers, there is a -1 to hit light infantry. So my best case scenario, even if I roll a 9, that -1 will bring it down to an 8. That'll be an automatic miss. So I cannot hit this light infantry at that range. So when all is said and done, I don't have a shot here. So I'll pass it back to Mark and say no defensive artillery for me.
All right. The next phase in Rhode Island, the next phase in the core system is rifle fire, but there are no rifle-armed units in this scenario, and so that phase is permanently skipped when you're playing this scenario. The next phase is the close combat. Combat is mandatory for adjacent units. In this case, we have 1 combat that's mandatory, von der Malsburg against Talbot. People that know the system like to say it's not the odds, it's the mods. That is to say, of course, you're going to calculate combat odds, but really what you're chasing in most combat situations is the accumulation of favorable modifiers. And modifiers come in a lot of flavors. The first modifier that we're going to consider, which you consider in every situation, is a comparison of unit morale. The unit morale on these playing pieces is the smaller number in the middle left, just to the left of the icon. Von der Malsburg has a +2. He's a crack unit. Talbot's not bad. He's Continental Light Infantry. He's got a +1. But nevertheless, von der Malsburg outclasses him. And so I get a +1 to my die roll for that difference in morale. If I had had a leader stacked in the hex, the leader would apply his combat modifier if he had one. If the defender was upslope from me or behind a creek or in some other terrain feature that would give him a bonus, then that would be subtracted from me. That's not the case here. We're on open ground. If I had him surrounded by either physical units or zones of control, I'd have him outflanked, and that would be another modifier. So you go down the list. It's printed off on the player aid card. It's nothing that you have to commit to memory, but once you've played BOAR a couple times, not even 2 full games, 2 or 3 game turns, you get right in the swing of how to find your modifiers, and they're easy to calculate. In this case, the straight up situation is pretty straightforward. It's a 2-to-1 attack with a +1 modifier. By the way, a moment ago, Rob said it's a 10-sided die. It's read 0 through 9, not 1 through 10. So when Rob said he had a 10% chance on a throw of a 9, if you're used to a 10-sided die that's read 1 through 10, that might have confused you. But we read ours 0 through 9. The last modifier is going to be a tactics play. Both players have an identical set of 8 tactics cards that we're going to be able to select from and put down. You're going to see Rob's choice because you're looking at his screen. You're going to see my choice go down as a question mark on a Union Jack. And I won't see Rob's choice. I'll see a question mark on a Betsy Ross flag, and we'll reveal those simultaneously. Before we play those tactics to the board, one last thing about that. In order to select from all 8 of the available tactics, you have to have leadership. You either have to have a leader adjacent to the attack or stacked in the attack, either would be fine, or you have to be a demi-leader. Now, if you'll look closely at von der Malsburg one more time, if Rob can hover over that unit, you'll see there's a 5-pointed gold star. That denotes this unit as a demi-leader unit. Colonel von der Malsburg and his crack chasseurs really carried the day for the Hessians this day. They attacked 3 times throughout the course of the day, and in most cases to good effect. So he has demi-leader status for himself. So even if my Hessian Major General von Lossberg, even if von Lossberg were here, let's say, and not adjacent to the attack, I'd still be able to pull all 8 tactics because I'm a demi-leader. If I were not a demi-leader, I'd still be able to pull all 8 tactics because I'm adjacent to von Lossberg. So either way, I'm covered. Rob, of course, has no leadership here, and so he's going to be restricted in which tactics he's allowed to pull from.
All right, are we ready to pull tactics?
Let's go ahead and pull them.
Okay. So yeah, as Mark said, I know everybody watching, you can see what I've put down here. That question mark in the upper left-hand corner means Mark can't see it yet, just so you know. He's not getting any secret information.
All right, we've both played, and we're going to reveal simultaneously. And so I'm skirmishing, which I think is an appropriate thing for chasseurs to do in the advance of an approaching column. Nothing says I'm compelled to use that tactic, but most of the time when I play, I like to impart an element of reality to what I do. Not always, though. And Rob, I think the intersection of my skirmish and your attack in echelon is my advantage, is it not?
It is. Yeah, the chart is saying that that's a +1 for you. And Mark, I have a breaking news update for you, which should make you smile. Several people have chimed in to say that White Plains has just hit the 500 mark on P500.
Thank you.
So
Thank
your presentation is having a positive effect here already.
If somebody on this call is responsible for being number 500, I vow to you that whenever we meet, whether it's virtually or live, and we play a game of BOAR, I will handicap you a free momentum chit. Thank you very much for all that, and God bless you all. So
actually, Rob, you're at 501 now, Mark.
Oh, fantastic! All right, so we've determined that these tactics give me an additional +1. So I have +1 for superior morale, unit morale, and +1 for a superior tactic. I'm now going to roll on the 10-sided combat results, or on the combat results table on the 2-to-1 column, adding 2 to my die roll, and here's my die roll in the upper right of the screen. Well, with all that hoopla, I only roll a 2, which gives me a net 4, and the result of a net 4 on a 2-to-1 attack is a mutual retreat. So whenever there's a mutual retreat, the defender always retreats first, and then the attacker.
All right, so I have to retreat 1 hex, and I don't know if you mentioned about retreat directions, Mark?
I didn't.
Okay, so down here in the corner of the map, it's showing you what are the allowable directions to retreat. So you see on the hex here, the blue hex sides means that I can retreat basically northeast, north, or northwest. So I'll go back here, and I think I'll just stay on the road. So I'm backing up 1 hex.
Right, and I'm going to retreat back on top of the first chasseurs because I will not be violating stacking by doing that. I now have 6 strength points, which is my limit, plus a free artillery piece. Now, if I had, because just to elaborate for one quick second, if I had more than the 1 unit there, the units that engaged are referred to as the lead units. Combat results on the table affect lead units. And in this case, it was a mutual retreat. If either of us had had other men in the hex, those men would now do individual morale checks to determine if they hold their ground or if they also retreat. Hopefully, when we get to the second part of the demo in a few more minutes, where we have stacks of units engaged, that may come up and you'll see that mechanic play out. All right, that was the close combat phase. That's the end of my player turn. I'm going to come down here to the game turn track and move the game turn marker down and flip it over. And it's Rob's half of turn one.
All right. So for me, for the American player here, the name of the game is kind of just delay as much as you can. You can probably see over here on the left side of the screen, these two hexes that are outlined in blue are objective hexes of kind of the near-term objective of where the British are trying to get to. I can actually get a victory point if I hold on to these hexes long enough. It's not likely that I will, because Mark is a very good player, and he's probably not going to give me an opening to do that. But for me, I think I'm just going to back up a little bit here. So at least get some of these guys on the roads where they can use that strategic movement to zip around. I'm going to back up with my artillery. I'll probably come up right here and maybe make a little bit of a stand. We'll see. So we'll do that up on top and down on the bottom. We'll see if Mark feels like fighting again. We'll give him a chance to do that. Or maybe I'll go back right here.
Okay.
All right, we'll call that my move.
He has no rally phase. Nobody's been disrupted. I have no artillery within range, so there's no defensive artillery fire, and nobody is adjacent, so there's no close combat. That's the end of turn one. We would now roll for initiative, and I propose, Rob, that we do one more turn on this opening part of the battle and then transition to the more complex or more nuanced later stage that we have preset.
Sure, that sounds good. So
we're at the top of turn two, and we need to establish initiative now. Go ahead.
And
Rob.
oh, sorry. Maybe you were just gonna. So this is the part where I think I have a momentum chit down here that can be used for this initiative roll, and I think I'd like to go ahead and use that here. So this the window down here you're seeing says how many momentum chits both sides hold. So momentum chits can be used in combat or for the initiative roll. If you spend them on the initiative roll, it gets you +2 to your die roll. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Mark that off here. So when we roll the dice, I'll be adding 2.
And we're both in high morale. So at the moment, when our army morales are high morale, there's no additional modifier. If one of us were already fatigued, that player would be adding nothing, while the player in high morale would be adding 1. Imagine a case where if the British were fatigued, Rob is in high morale. He's going to add 1 anyway, and he can spend momentum to add 2 more. Now he's adding 3 to the initiative roll, really improving his odds, really improving his chances of capturing the initiative and stealing a march on me. Again, the idea, as Rob articulated so well, is to trade space for time in the opening phases of this scenario as the American player. So let's go ahead and roll, Rob.
Okay, I'll go ahead and roll first here. Oh, only a 1, so that +2 gives me a 3, which is still quite beatable by you. Aha! So the initiative made the difference, or the momentum made the difference.
That's right. Okay. And so it worked out for him. There you go. And it's the American player with a back-to-back move. Now, he's not in a position to use back-to-back to exploit a combat situation, as I was sort of alluding to in my opening remarks about the system, but he is got the initiative now to steal a march on me and put a lot of distance if he wants to, so that I cannot close on him.
Well,
In this opening part of the game, I have the superior forces. As the game unfolds, the forces equalize.
I think down here on the bottom of the screen, the western half, the west road, I'm going to fall back to kind of a nice position there behind that creek. Gives me some advantages if we get into combat again. And
Guarding the bridge.
Using the strategic movement. And up here, let's see. The artillery is kind of the deciding factor because it moves slower than everyone else. So I think I'm just going to go one. Oh, let's back up. Not a whole bunch, but a little bit, at least that far. So we'll go there, keep Colonel Livingston with them. And these guys will be down here for support as well. We'll have them on the middle road. So we've got all the roads at least with somebody watching them. And I always like to put my artillery on the top of the staff so that the other player knows where it is, where he's got to be conscious of maybe taking some artillery shots. So I'll call that my move.
All right, and again, there's no rally phase. I have no defensive artillery fire, and there's no close combat. And we move to the bottom half of the turn. I've got incoming Hessian reinforcements, which I will send to the reinforcement hex. This is Bauermeister's battery. Of course, he did trade space for time. He got out of range of me. I'm not going to burn the clock here by just tediously moving everybody up for no good reason. You sort of get the idea. What I will point out, though, before we flip it over to part 2 of the demo, is you've noticed that on the American side, the combat, the strength point and movement point values have different colors. Livingston's men up on the East Road have yellow values. Lawrence's 2-unit command has orange values. And back on the main American line, 4 of the units have their values printed in white, the rest in black. These distinctions are quick and easy ways for the American player, well, for both players, to be aware of command and control not restrictions, but command and control on the American side. Lawrence, the demi-leader, can command anybody in his command. Well, there's only 2 guys, himself and Talbot. But to help you remember that, they're printed orange. Livingston can command his command. Everybody printed in yellow. There's, I think, 5 units plus artillery. When I say command, if he's stacked with them, he can add his combat modifier. He can add his rally modifier if they are disrupted and trying to rally. He can help influence tactics. On the main line for the Americans, the 2 colors back there, white and black, have to do with sortie restrictions. You may have noticed that Rob didn't move anybody back there as the game began. That's because the main American line is under a sortie restriction. They cannot move until certain trigger points in the game. The 4 units printed in white can move on turn 5. The rest of the American army can move on turn 7. And so, again, the color coding just helps players remember all that in a clean and elegant way without having to keep referring to rule books and charts and things like that. Rob, can we go ahead and flip this over to the later in the day of the same battle? And we've set up a situation here for you.
Yep, absolutely. So, Mark,
and I need
if you go up to the window with the games and where you see that SD HistCon demo room, if you just double click or join the demo number 2 game, that'll take you right over to us.
I've got to find that window, Rob.
Up in the upper right corner.
And I'm not seeing it. I don't know why. You're talking about. I see the log file. You know, all of those notes, but I don't have the game room and all that stuff showing.
Let's see. If you go up to the toolbar at the very top, we have the retire
Yeah.
encounters and card. If you hit the one with the 2 arrows on the left, just to the left of the retire button, does that bring it up, or does that put...
My tool button gives me refresh and load.
Did you hit the button that has the 2 arrows going in opposite directions?
I will, should I?
Yeah, go ahead. Hit that one.
There it is.
Okay,
Got it.
All right.
All right. So now I just need to double click on demo 2.
Yes, correct.
Or right click, I should say, in join room.
Yep.
There we go.
There, we're okay. Now I see you coming in.
All right. So here you have the same battle map, and you see the situation at 1 p.m. on the bottom of game turn 7. You see those 2 objective hexes that Rob referred to that were blue at the start of the game have been shaded red, indicating the British player now controls them. For the Americans, those are worth victory points if they control them. For the British, those are worth card draw if the British control them. And so at the end of this game turn, turn 7, by virtue of my control of these hexes, I will get 2 card draws, 1 for each space. You'll notice down in the water there in the bay that I've got my squadron afloat. It's now in the game and hovering offshore, off the Hessian left flank there. We've got an American disrupted unit under the rally on me marker. And other than that, you've got units that have moved up and are in position and so on. It's the British half of the turn, so I'm going to go ahead now and maneuver. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. That yellow banded unit I just moved, those are American Loyalist Infantry fighting with the British. That's the King's American Regiment, as you can see. I'm going to play a card, Rob.
Okay.
And let me go up to my cards here. I'm going to play this one, which is going to come down to the map board. This is Familiar Roads, played during friendly movement. This allows 1 British player combat unit to move an additional 2 movement points this turn. So I'm going to come up here to the 43rd foot. Coming down slope costs +1 movement point. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Normally that's as far as he could go, but with the bonus 2 movement points, he's going to come here for 5 movement points so he can engage Colonel Lawrence. I'm going to bring von der Malsburg down here. He's got a movement of 6, no problem getting there. I think I'll bring the Ansbachers 1, 2 down slope, 3, 4 here. And let's bring the I'm going to bring the which guy is that? That's the 54th foot, 1/2 1, 1/2 2, 1/2 3. They're going to come up into this position on the ridge that was just vacated by the other 5 strength unit. The 22nd foot will hold. I think I'll bring my light infantry a little tighter on the flank. And let's come on up the road. 1, 2, 3 movement points there. He could go 4, but I choose to halt there. Over here, I've got my army commanders arriving. Major General the Baronet Pigot with the 17th Light Dragoons. The Dragoons can move 6. Pigot can move 6. On road, they can move 12. So let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and a half. And then these guns, 1, 2, 3. And do I have anybody in the rear? I do not. Everybody in the scenario is up. Whoops. Actually, you know what? Hold on. I mismoved these guys. Instead of here, he was going to go there. And instead of there, he was going to go there. Yes. And now I'm going to bring my flotilla right up here, one of the markers. And let's see, let's bring this Hessian artillery off the hill. 1, 2, 3. And everybody else is good. Okay, that's it for my movement phase. We have rally phase. For me, I have nobody disrupted, as you can see. Rob, although he has someone disrupted, he's not the phasing player, so he has to wait for his turn to try to rally that guy. But he does get defensive artillery fire, and in this case, he's got ample targets.
All right. Well, let's see what you've given me here. All right. So I've got, looks like at least 3 artillery units that probably have a shot here. So let me start down here on the bottom with this artillery that's in the artillery redoubt, appropriately enough. So this is Jackson's Battery B. And let's see. Let's take a shot at the guy who's right in front of him under von Lossberg here. That would be von Hein. So I've got 1 strength point firing. Going back to my chart here. 1 strength point firing. Now that target is adjacent to me. And so that gives me a 7 to hit. And he is not a light unit. He doesn't have any other modifier that would help or hurt him. So it looks like I need a 7 to hit. So I will roll that. And I just missed with a 6. No dice there. All right, I'll go up to Providence next, this artillery unit nearby. Providence, Rhode Island, militia artillery. He's going to shoot also probably at his best target, the King's American Regiment right next to him. Again, 1 strength point firing adjacent, so same situation, need a 7 to hit. Here's the roll. We got a hit this time with an 8. Okay, so with a hit, now we go over to the damage table, which is over here right underneath the 2-hit table. So I'm artillery. My target, there's 2 different damage tables here. One for shooting at artillery, one for shooting at anybody who's not artillery. So being as he's infantry, I'm looking at the non-artillery side of that table. And I will roll the die to see what the result is. I rolled a 4, and it looks like disrupt. 4 through 6 gives me a disrupt. So the King's American Regiment has been disrupted.
All right, so I'm going to disrupt him. He's now disrupted, and if you look up real quick, Rob, if you would, to the Army morale track.
Yeah, it just jumped up there. Yep.
That, we preset the game with the American, with the scenario rather, with the British at their starting morale of 14, and the Americans, by virtue of having been faced to this point in the game, they have a casualty in the casualty box, hypothetically. And so they're down to fatigue status, you'll notice. But when I got disrupted, my Army morale dropped by 1. If I rally that unit subsequently, I'll recover that point of morale. Rob does not gain morale for disrupting me. If he had caused me a step loss, however, he would gain while I would also lose. Okay, so now a disrupted unit has to fall back 3 spaces. 1, stacking applies at all times, so I can't go back through the first onspot, and I can't go up into hex 2508, where you see to my upper right rear there because of zone of control by Lawrence. So I've got to go here for my second hex and then back here for my third hex. Okay, continue your defensive fire.
All right, so I think I have one more left. Let me check these stacks. Oh, no, looks like Salem Volunteer Artillery. Looks like, so line of sight rules being what they are, friendly units block line of sight. You can see the Salem Volunteers do not have a shot at 43rd Foot because Lawrence is blocking that. So no shot there. So I do believe, yeah, that leaves just Jackson's Battery A up here with the last potential shot. And I believe he's got he's got a line of sight to Smith's Hex. So looking at the units that are in Smith's Hex, the British have an artillery unit there. Those are always +1 to hit. They're a little bit easier to hit. So I'm going to go ahead and shoot at your Royal Artillery Detachment, Mark.
All right.
And it's 1 strength point again, firing at a range of 3, which gives me a base of 9 to hit. But again, +1 because I'm firing at artillery, so I'll need an 8 or better to hit. And another close shot, but
good shooting. Good shooting. All right. Close combat phase. It's mandatory for adjacent units. You must pre-declare every attack before resolving any attack. So you're not allowed to see how one fight goes and then decide who's going to do what further up the battle line. Now, in this case, because he pushed the King's American away, which I'm just going to move it for the moment, it was here, remember, I would have had a situation here where I would need to declare what I was doing because I had multiple adjacencies, but he pushed him out. I'm left with what are essentially 3 straightforward attacks. The 43rd Foot straight ahead against Lawrence, von der Malsburg and von Hein, up the hill against the artillery redoubt, and von der Malsburg and the 2nd Ansbachers against the 1st Canadian and Webb under Green. So it's self-evident in this case, but for the record, those are my 3 attacks. Let's start up here where I've got a really good shot, a good chance. The 43rd Foot with 5 strength points attacking Lawrence, who's on his damaged side. He's only got 1 strength point remaining. So it's 5-1. The maximum combat odds ratio goes up to 4-1. So anything above 4-1 is treated as 4-1. This is therefore a 4-1 attack. We compare unit morales. We are both +1. And in this case, I'm adjacent to a leader. So I'm going to get to pull all the tactics. And Lawrence is himself a demi-leader. So he'll get to pull all 8 of his tactics. So it's a 4-1 attack, even odds, going into the tactics card.
all right, I'm going to pull out a tactic.
And I think our viewers will forgive us for pre-staging what we wanted to show, Rob, but I'm compelled to remind you that this was an opportunity for you to play the other random event opportunity card.
I was just opening up my cards to say, I should look and remember what I have there. So.
Yeah, we want to showcase, elements of the game.
Right.
So rightly, we would put tactics down, but Rob's going to preempt that with the play of a card.
Let me go ahead and do this since there is a card that relates to the unit in play here. So I'm going to zoom down here. You can see what we're talking about. So I was holding this card, a Prudent and Admiral Withdrawal, where Lawrence is defending alone. He can automatically retreat 1 or 2 hexes at the American player's discretion, and no enemy units may advance. So this would be a very good time to play that. As Mark noted, it's a 4-1 attack, which is odds are pretty bad against me. So rather than doing that, let me go ahead and play that. I can retreat 1 or 2 hexes, so I think I'll scurry back here to the safety of these supporting units next to him. And as that card said too, normally the attacker gets to advance after the combat, not the case when you play this card.
Right, and actually advance after combat into a vacated hex is mandatory, not optional, for lead units. It's optional for other participating units that were not the lead unit, but lead units must advance. And so, if you shoot pool or play golf, you know that it's all about the lie. It isn't so much the shot you're taking, it's the shot you're setting yourself up to take on the next shot, and where the cue ball's going to be or where the golf ball's going to be. And so sometimes you don't want to attack, even if it's favorable, because the notion that you would have to advance into a vacated space might put you in a spot that you don't want to find yourself in. So that's something else to keep in mind. All right, so that was a bust, and we'll move down. I want to attack the artillery redoubt. I was going to have a 9 against 3, and I was going to use my diversion against Cornell's infantry that's under the Providence artillery there. I was going to divert that hex. Remember, you can divert 1 hex for every combat phase. That would have allowed me to combine the King's American Regiment and von Hein against the artillery redoubt upslope. He pushed the King's American out, so the poor von Hein regiment is left alone, has no choice but to attack by itself up the hill. I'm 5, he's 3. That's a 3-2 odds. We do have a 3-2 table on the CRT. In this case, I'm a +1 for unit morale, but Rob gets to declare his lead unit because he has more than one lead unit in the hex.
Let me, I'm just going to show everyone, because I know they can't see the terrain underneath what we're talking about here. I just want to show them here. There's both the hill and the redoubt that are helping me here. So that's the terrain that's underneath underneath our units here. Okay, so yes, I have to pick a lead unit. Most often you're going to go with the one with the highest unit morale. And in that case, I think I will do that here. So I have the 1st Rhode Island that has a +2 for unit morale. Normally, however, if you remember, for this situation, my army morale is down here into fatigued. And one of the penalties that comes with that is that everybody's unit morale is -1. So since my army morale has been pushed down this far, that actually means that the guy who would normally be a +2 is only a +1. But nevertheless, I'll go with him. So I'm going to say 1st Rhode Island is my lead unit.
Right. And if you could stay hovered over him for 1 second, if I could be allowed one vanity,
Sure.
It is to say that we do try to be as accurate and authentic as possible in depicting everything in our games, including individual units, uniforms. Here you have the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, the 1st Regiment of Colored Troops, as they were called at the time. And so you see the coloring there, the flesh tone coloring is appropriate. The 1st Rhode Island was dressed in an all-white uniform with a light infantry cap and plume, and we have that featured on the counter. At 5/8 inches, you can see them pretty well when you're playing live, with a physical game. And of course, when you're playing virtually, you can enlarge your screen and really get a good look at some of the artwork on these counters. So our unit morales are even, but I'm attacking upslope, that's -1. I'm attacking into a redoubt, that's another -1. So right now, it's a 3-2 attack, -2. I have a leader stacked with the attack, von Lossberg. He has a command rating of 1 for combat. That offsets one of those negative modifiers. So now our net is only -1. Now I'm going to throw my squadron in. I'm going to attempt offshore bombardment with my squadron in an attempt to gain additional modifiers. So if you can track the screen down to the offshore bombardment table, Rob.
Yep.
There you see the possibilities. But I'm going to play a card at this point. And on the map board, you can see my card. It's called Superior Gunnery. Play during offshore bombardment. +2 die roll modifier when firing on the offshore bombardment table. It's not available to me if this was the night turn. So I'm going to roll on this table to try to earn additional modifiers in this close combat with a +2 to this die roll. I'm the attacking player, and so I'm looking for positive results on the table. If I were firing my squadron in support of a defensive action, I would be looking for the negative results. So here's my die roll. 7 + 2 is 9. 9 gives me +2 to my attacking die roll. I was net -1. With 2 more, I'm now net +1 to the attack. Again, just to summarize, we looked at unit morales first. Because Rob is fatigued, our unit morales were even. We then looked at terrain. There was a net 2 against me, upslope and redoubt. But then we looked at leadership. I've got a commanding leader with a command value. He does not. That offset one of those. I was net -1, but now because of offshore bombardment, I am net +1. The squadron marker goes away. I only get 2 shots in the game, and they're represented by the squadron markers. The final thing we do is pick a tactics card, just like we did before. Right now I'm at net +1. And we're going for all of it with cold steel. You outplayed me there. I believe that is a
-1.
-1, is it not?
Yep. Frontal assault to commit reserve is
Right.
-1.
So that -1, because he brought reserves up to blunt my frontal assault, that brings us back to a net of 0 modifiers on the 3-2 column. But you can see how the game really revolves not so much around the odds you can achieve, but on the modifiers that you try to accumulate. And by the way, Rob was able to pick all the tactics because the 1st Rhode Island is a demi-leader for himself and the 2nd Rhode Island if they occupy the redoubt, which they do. And so he had all the cards to pull from. So here's my roll at 3-2 odds with no modifiers. A 3 at 3-2 with a 3. I would retreat. For the sake of time, I'm going to just come down here and spend my 1 momentum chit and ask for a re-roll of that combat dice. I'm banking for something better. I want to try to occupy that space if I can.
All right,
so
coming up the slopes
re-roll.
again.
Yeah, I can't do much worse than a 3. So here's my my second wave of von Hein. The pontooners prodding them along. Here we go. A 5 is a little bit better, and that's a mutual retreat. And again, defender executes first.
All right, so taking my lead unit, he must retreat with that result, so I'll back him up to there. Then I've got 2 other units that they're going to have to roll to see whether they retreat or not. So I'll start off with my top one, which is the artillery unit, Jackson's Battery B. So he's got +1, but that's actually a 0 because, again, with my army morale, having everybody's unit morale down 1, that +1 becomes a 0. And then for me, I do get one other advantage because I'm in this redoubt. Any units that are making this check, just because they are in a redoubt, get a +1. So after all of that is put together, it looks like I'm a +1 on my check here. So I will make that roll for Jackson's Battery B. 3 becomes a 4, but that's not quite enough because you're looking for a 5 at least. So he's going to have to retreat. He'll go back and join 1st Rhode Island. And now let's see if 2nd Rhode Island can hold the hex. He's also going to be rolling at net +1. No, they all fail. They were frightened off by 2 successive Hessian charges, I guess. So he's going to retreat as well. I think I'll keep them all in there. And that's everything for me. And the redoubt is empty at the moment.
Yeah, and unfortunately the outcome was mutual retreat.
Yes.
And so my lead unit, which is the one and only unit I had in this attack, is compelled to retreat. and will. If I had even one more unit present and it passed its morale check, it could, on a voluntary basis, move up and occupy that victory objective. And in all probability, I probably would have. So I'm not going to execute this final attack because we're down to 12 minutes by my clock, and I want to at least say a few things about White Plains. But I hope this two-part demo gives you a sense of how the core system and some of the Chrome all works together to create, a pretty, compelling and I think tense battlefield situation. So let's, Rob, if we would go on to.
Yep, we're up.
And let's see. There we go. So this, of course, is my hand-drawn prototype map. You're looking at the southern end of the battlefield. Rob, is it possible to go to a 40,000-foot view where we can maybe see and maybe rotate this?
Yeah, I know they're not going to be able to see much detail zoomed further out, but how does that look? Is that about what you want?
Yeah, and can we go even one click further out than that?
Sure.
I know there's going to be, oh, well.
That's pretty far out.
Let's go back in, at least one more.
Okay.
All right, you can see some of the main terrain features on the battlefield at White Plains. The Bronx River is the primary waterway on the left side. It has a graduating degree of crossing penalty from prohibited crossing to a +2 movement point crossing to a +1 movement point crossing, denoted by the darker or a more narrow shading of the river itself. You can see the obvious hills. There are some dominant hills. Chatterton Hill, can we zoom in on Chatterton Hill, where the historic Battle of White Plains took place, right there, just over the Bronx River. Slowly scrolling up the map north, we see the village of White Plains come into view. We see Purdy Hill with some redoubts on top. That was the anchor of the American right flank. As we continue to scroll up, we see more American field works, and then we come to Hatfield Hill and Horton's Pond, which anchored the American left flank. Back to the southern end of the map, if you would, for me, Rob. The British start the game by arriving on the battlefield, and I know the demo, I didn't expect. I'm glad we spent the time we spent on the demo, because I think the demo was, of course, the nuts and bolts of this session. But I wish I had 10 more minutes. But I'll do my best to capture in 10 minutes anyway what's happening here. This is the end of the New York campaign. The only remaining action of any note is the attack on Fort Washington, on the American garrison that was left behind on Manhattan in Fort Washington on November, I believe, the 15th or 16th. That's successful, and with that fall of Fort Washington, the British consolidate control over New York, and they won't relinquish it until 1783. It's their last post to be evacuated in North America. But what we have here is both armies are in maneuver at this point. Washington, as you know, was outflanked and beaten at the Battle of Long Island, also known as Brooklyn Heights. He escaped across the East River thanks to Colonel Glover's Marblehead, Massachusetts fishermen who rowed small boats all night long and in a fog and conveyed the army to safety. They were outflanked again a month later when the British launched an amphibious attack at Kips Bay, halfway up Manhattan Island. They were slow to exploit the beachhead, and the units down in Manhattan were able to force march and get away up to Harlem Heights, where there were some prepared American positions. There was a small skirmish at Harlem Heights, which was essentially a stalemate, and then the armies hunkered down there for almost a full month. General Howe decided he would use his navy again, naval supremacy again, to outflank the Americans one more time by getting up into Westchester County to get behind the American army and crush it. He made a series of two amphibious attacks. The first one was on poorly chosen ground, and they couldn't break out of their beachhead. The second one was more advantageous ground, but again, slow to exploit his opportunity, giving Washington time to leave the Harlem Heights lines and race up into Westchester County. If you scroll up for me, Rob, back to the village of White Plains, and if you could give me a couple of degrees of more, pull the view out a couple of more degrees, maybe to, what are we?
Oop.
No, not in,
Yeah,
out.
sorry, here we go.
One more, try one more. Okay. I know the resolution is hard to see, but the road net around White Plains, particularly when you look at this map in real life, is very, very reminiscent. I'm going to use the word reminiscent, not the word identical. It's reminiscent of Gettysburg. If you're in Westchester County, all roads lead to White Plains. From White Plains, you can get to Tarrytown on the Hudson River. If you're the British, you can rendezvous with your Navy that has already run the guns of Forts Washington and Lee and crossed over the Chevaux de Frise barrier in the river that was intended to block shipping and didn't work. If you're in White Plains, you can go east a few miles and be in Connecticut. If you're in White Plains, you can go due north into the Hudson Highlands and threaten the upper Hudson Valley. And of course, White Plains is only 20 miles north of New York City. And the road net converges here. So the British move into Westchester County, Washington pulls back into Westchester County, and both armies converge at White Plains. Washington got here first, and just like the story of Gettysburg is reminiscent, he sent his engineer, Rufus Putnam, on ahead to survey the ground and kind of feel out where the British were. And Putnam recognized the value of these commanding heights, Purdy Hill and Hatfield Hill, and he informed Lord Stirling, who was commanding the American vanguard, to double time it up to White Plains and get on this high ground before the British arrived, because like at Gettysburg, whoever could get to the high ground first would have a decided advantage. Washington got here on the 22nd of October. The British got here on the 28th of October. So Washington had the better part of a week to dig in. If you can zoom in for me, Rob, on that same view, you see that Washington actually digs in on two lines of fortifications. One tracks right along the village of White Plains itself. It's that dashed black and red line. There you go. He's moving his cursor. That's the forward line, and then the solid red lines on my prototype map are the more formal trenches and redoubts that constitute the second line. His flanks can't be turned because of the high ground and the terrain off to the east toward Connecticut, and he's ready for an attack. Although almost half his army is militia, which is very suspect, particularly in this opening phase of the war, he is ready to receive an attack on this ground. The problem is he overlooked Chatterton Hill. If you can scroll back down to Chatterton Hill for me. This was left undefended until the eve of battle, literally the night before. He belatedly sent some militia up there to begin digging in, but the British arrived early in the morning the very next day, and Washington belatedly sent what ended up being about 2,000 troops to make a stand on Chatterton Hill. The British saw the value right away, and with primarily Hessian troops, attacked Chatterton Hill in force, 4,000 to 2,000, plus the British committed a 14-gun battery to soften up the American position, and the hill was overrun. For the next 9 days, these two armies essentially sat in place. General Howe for the British was probing, looking for an opportunity, trying the flanks, looking for a soft spot. Washington improved his positions. Once Chatterton Hill fell, he refused his right, and then eventually pulled his entire right flank back on an oblique. If you'll scroll up to the top of the map for me, Rob. He left his left flank on Hatfield Hill, but then pulled his right flank back on an oblique angle across Fisher Hill and toward Mount Misery and Miller Hill, where there was even higher ground. 30,000 combatants, eventually 15,400 on the British side, 14,500 Americans were engaged here for 9 days on a front that was only 3 miles wide. And while there was an opportunity for either side to end up with a decisive outcome, historically, that did not happen. We give you the opportunity to model that here at White Plains. There's a historical scenario, which is just the fight for Chatterton Hill, precisely the way it unfolded. A short 4.5 turn game that's very, very tension packed because every single strength point matters. Then the Grand Assault, which is October the 31st. General Howe was going to launch his Grand Assault. He had 3 divisions. We know who was in those divisions, essentially where they were deployed. We know where the Americans were deployed, and we get to see what might have happened. General Howe called off that assault on the 31st because of inclement weather, but we get to see what might have happened. And then, in a real stretch for the BOAR system, the full campaign game at White Plains is 42 game turns. It's the full 4 days of 9 during which the armies were in close proximity, threatening one another with the opportunity to have something decisive take place. So I did want to close by saying a few things about the challenging elements of game design in this period in general and White Plains in particular, but I'm going to invite those of you on the call that have an interest in that to reach out to me individually. I would love to engage you in whether it's email or phone call or text or whatever you prefer, and we can talk about some of that and the ways in which my colleagues and I solved for that. I do want to give one quick shout out to a gentleman that's on the call. I hope he's still here. I know I saw his name earlier. Yes, he's still with us. His name is Phil Varker. He's a resident of Westchester County and a BOAR enthusiast, and he was my eyes and ears on the ground. He had access to resources I never could have dredged up, and spent many a weekend carrying his wife and children in tow, traipsing around this battlefield, finding significant points and helping me determine literally where the key terrain features needed to be and so forth. So kudos to Phil Varker for that. But again, reach out to me if you have an interest in a conversation about the challenges of designing in this period, or the challenges particularly of designing the Battle of White Plains. And last but not least, a thank you, because, you know, I'm the designer, that's all well and good, but I'm not in this alone. I've got a veritable army of individuals who have gravitated to this series, become my friends, and have helped me. I've had a couple of co-designers for some of the games, Dr. Don Hanley, who helped design Pensacola and Oriskany, Bill Madison with Germantown, some great developers, Andy Lewis from GMT, Dave Stifler, and Rob McCracken for their ongoing help, Rob Doan, who's with us on this demo, for his great work on Vassal and some keen insights on the Battle of Rhode Island, all the volunteer game masters in the tournaments over the years who have run these events for us, and the army of playtesters who have helped us iron out the bugs. And last but not least, my own family. I've got 2 sons, both of whom are grown men now in their late 20s, both of them area rated players, and they basically grew up with the BOAR system, and they'll call bullshit, if you'll pardon my language, when I'm going down a rabbit hole or doing something crazy. So appreciate their help every step of the way, and also my wife, who's been eminently patient and has helped me with all my prototype graphics. So with that, I think we're only 3 or 4 minutes over time, but I want to thank everybody for your attention. I guess we're out of time for questions. I don't know if Harold, if you're still here, I don't know what the protocol is for running long on one of these.
Mark, you can stay as long as you want. You can stay until 3 a.m. if you'd like.
Well, with that permission, then I will open it up to questions, particularly as it might relate to the series or to White Plains? Or Rob, if there have been any questions that came in the text box that you think I should field?
Yep, nope. There have been a few that I've been fielding here that are just kind of basic factual things. So we're all set in the text channel.
Well, does anyone have a question for me that you'd like to do audio?
Hey, Mark, this is John Vinyl.
Hey, John.
There's a couple of things on the Rhode Island games that might need a little clarification on, had me confused. One is the terrain's effects chart when you're dealing with artillery and cavalry crossing field works. What confuses me is I see a P, which I think means prohibited, not permitted. But then you have this footnote about a +1 movement penalty.
Right. So the simplest way, John, to remember all that is terrain effects penalties apply to the enemy player. And so for an enemy player to cross a position in a movement phase where it's marked prohibited, it's prohibited. Now they can attack in certain cases. For example, cavalry are permitted to attack across abattis in the combat phase, but not crossing in the movement phase. But where there is a movement modifier in terrain that is otherwise prohibited, that would apply to friendly units. They're prohibited, but they get a modifier to cross. Does that make sense?
I think so. What happens if you have like a readout and it changes sides?
Again, whoever possesses a position is the friendly player in that position.
Okay. All right, I think I got. The other has to do with the vassal mod.
Rob Jones on the call. He can answer that one.
Okay, there's a breach marker. I think it's in both the Newport and the Rhode Island, although I think it's used only for Newport.
Right. Uh-huh.
And are they supposed to point to the hex side or the hex vertex?
So I think I just put out an updated version of the module that fixed that. I think you're right. In the initial versions, I had them pointing to the wrong one. It was to the hex, the vertex instead of the side. So I fixed that in this newest version. If you haven't downloaded it, yeah, go back to the Vassal website and get them. And yeah, that'll be fixed.
All righty. Well, I just wanted to say thank you to you and Mark for all the support you've given the series, keeping it going with Presidents, Custom World, and the demo.
Thank you, John.
Conventions and everything has been so successful.
Mark,
appreciate that very much.
Mark, yes. There's a question on the text channel. Somebody wants to know any plans for Long Island and the Battle of Brooklyn.
Well, if I don't know. The short answer is I don't know. What I do know is this. My original ambition, once we realized that there were legs in this series and we could have a actual series and not just a one-off with the Battle of Saratoga 23 years ago, I set a personal goal to design 10. And now that White Plains is on P500, of course, we have our 10th volume. And at PresCon, a couple years ago, when I was asked how many I was going to do, Rhode Island was about to come out at the time. I said, well, you're about to get Rhode Island, number 9, and that I'm going to do 10. And I think Dave Stifler was there. He's on this call, or he was earlier. You might have been there, Rob, maybe not. But there was a bit of an outcry among the 6 or 8 or 10 people that were hovered around the BOAR final. Said, you can't stop at 10. There were 13 colonies. Now, if you think about it, that's brilliant marketing. If this series has had enough horsepower to have 10 volumes with all these battles and scenarios, it surely can endure for 3 more. And then one can say that GMT has a Battles of the American Revolution series of 13 volumes. And all of that is to say, in answer of the question, I don't know. I think I know what number 11 will be, but I don't yet have any inkling for 12 and 13. And please consider your suggestion duly noted.
And Mark, since you're retired, I'm just going to say the answer is not are you going to do a particular battle? It's when are you going to do that particular battle?
That's right. Well, I'm semi-retired, so there is that.
We
But
will.
I certainly have found that I have a lot more time. If you go from 1998 to 2021, where we are now, that's a release of one title, one volume on average every 2.5 years. Because I raised a family, built a career, lived a life, lived in several homes, moved from state to state, like we all do, right? But I pushed them out every 2.5 years. White Plains went from concept to prototype ready for P500 in 11 months, which is lightning fast by my standard and really does indicate the pace at which I can go from this point forward.
There's another question. Somebody wants to know about the small bore system. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yes, thank you. Again, the scale in BOAR is 200 yards per hex, 100 men per strength point, 30 minutes per player turn. And so we're restricted, are we not, to battles that can accommodate this scale. The smallest one I can do at this scale and still have meaningful counter density is Utah Springs, where there were quite literally 2,200 men on each side in the historical battle. And that allows for, a dozen, 15, some odd counters per side, depending on the regiment or the battalion or whatever. And people have said, well, why don't you do Trenton or Bunker Hill? Well, to do Trenton, the British player would have 3 counters, maybe 2. And the American player would have, 5 or 6. That doesn't make for much of a game. But small bore is where we're headed. In order to bring into the mix these wealth of very important smaller battles that occurred in the Revolutionary War, and there were so many of them. We've lowered the scale to 25 yards per hex. We've lowered the strength point value to about a 10 or 12 men, I believe it is. We've reduced the turn to a few minutes rather than 30 minutes per player turn. And so we are keeping the core concept. If it looks like a duck and waddles like a duck and sounds like a duck, it's probably a duck. So you'll pick up small bore and it'll feel like these games. And you'll be right at home and you won't miss a beat. But you'll be able to engage at Cowpens and Bennington and Hubbardton and even Cooch's Bridge in Delaware, which was a preliminary to the Brandywine campaign as the British Army was maneuvering from Head of Elk up toward Brandywine, at Kennett Square in Brandywine and eventually Philadelphia. So we already have Cowpens well underway. We made a site visit, several of us. The designer for Cowpens is Bruno Sinigaglio. Many of you know him. He's a devoted player to BOAR and a friend of the series and a fan and a colleague of ours. And he's designing Cowpens. Dave Stifler is developing. It's well along. It will be the first one. We've got another gentleman working on Bennington and Hubbardton, and another Rob McCracken working on Cooch's Bridge. So hopefully in short order, we'll be able to offer a site, a tangent to bore, small bore, which will bring all these other wonderful experiences to your table.
Hi, Mark. Another question. Well, first of all, many thanks for your games. I've been playing this series for 19 years, and I'm enjoying all the game. So my question is, what happened to Polyur, the battle in India? Because we were talking on Causing Wall about it. It was going to be in the next volume, but eventually you dropped it, and I used a bigger size White Plains game.
Yes, what a great question, and thanks for being with us today, Mr. Espino. I enjoy talking to you on Constant World. He's talking about the Battle of Polyur in India in 1780, I think, or 81. The American Revolution goes to India. Imagine phalanx-style spearmen that Alexander the Great would recognize if he came back from the dead and saw the battlefield. Imagine hordes of light and medium cavalry and lancers. Imagine elephants, war elephants. Imagine, if you will, one of the first effective uses of rockets. In fact, young Ensign Congreve was in the British Army and was on the receiving end of Mysore rocket attack, which inspired him to develop rockets for the British Army, which of course came into play later in the Victorian period and so on. The British East India Company is opposed to the native Mysore forces. The British East India Company is supported by British regulars from the continental establishment, from the regular establishment, and the Mysore troops are supported by the French. And why is this a battle of the American Revolution? Well, when the French entered the war, it changed the entire calculus. Everybody on this call knows that. Once the war became a global war, the theater expanded well beyond the 13 colonies. It could be argued that the 13 colonies in some respects became a backwater theater. And one of the places that the great superpowers engaged was in India. Now, there are troops that the British sent to India to support the British East India Company that might have otherwise fought in North America. And there's French troops that were sent to support the Mysore forces that might otherwise have been sent to North America or elsewhere, perhaps where the British and French were engaged. And so there's an argument to be made that one could consider the Mysore campaign. I think this is the first Mysore War. There were two, or maybe it's the second. Forgive me for getting that confused, but I'm not the primary designer on that one. Don Hanley is, and he's done a masterful job. It uses the core BOAR system. One army is conventional. Think a little bit about Newtown, where the Iroquois player is asymmetrical and unconventional, and the American player is Major General Sullivan commanding the Continental Army. And you have something very similar here. The British have to get a relief column across the map to relieve a siege of one of their cities. The Mysore player tries to interdict that relief column while maintaining the siege of the other city. It's very BOAR, but it has these wonderful elements. Now, to the specific question, we thought about it as a B-side game, but White Plains is so big. It is bigger than any BOAR game yet. There are more counters. It's bigger than Brandywine. It's bigger than Monmouth. It's bigger than Germantown. It's the biggest yet. And when we considered how big it was and the fact that it's already a bit of a stretch with some of the, with the fact that it's 42 turns long and what have you, if you play the full campaign, we decided it was not practical just from a production standpoint and cost-effective standpoint to put another game on the B side. It is still out there. I know that in a recent conversation that Don had by email with Gene Billingsley, Gene said he's looking forward to seeing how the American Revolution translates to India. So I would say that while the game is well along in design, how we're exactly going to position it and when we'll see it and what form that takes is still under advisement. But fear not, it is out there and it is coming.
Many thanks.
Hey, Mark, this is Andy McGuire, and I wanted to thank you again for the presentation today. The Battle of Rhode Island in particular has special meaning for me because I had a chance to live in Newport for a year. And so as I was studying the map, it looks like our house was right next to the British headquarters location there by Easton's Pond. So always cool to be able to war game your old neighborhood. But
Yeah.
I want to ask you a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask Rob to scroll that map down to that forward British field headquarters so we can take a look at
we're on it actually, right where Prescott is sitting here.
right there. Oh, yes, there it is. Right.
Is that where your house was, Andy?
Yeah,
That's
it's
awesome.
it's just really amazing to see. But obviously, a lot of historical research goes into the whole series, and I mean, I've walked many of these very roads here. Can you talk a little bit more about that research process, and particularly how battlefield walkthroughs kind of inform you as to your understanding and depiction of the battle in the game?
Right, and that's a great question. And I like to get to every battlefield for every game I've designed, and I have to admit that I've not been to the Rhode Island battlefield or to the community of Newport in order to walk what may remain of these battlefield locations, because as you all well know, some battlefields are preserved and protected property, and if you're doing those battles well, you have it. You know, the battlefield is your oyster. You have the archives. You have the park rangers. You can pitch a tent and stay there for weeks. If it's a community like this that's been urbanized, or White Plains, or Savannah, or Pensacola, or some of the others, well, then you have to go there and you have to find what you can find based on period maps and references in the narrative text, and try to find those locations and see for yourself. Now, I admitted I was not to this one yet, although Darlene and I, and Rob Doan lives in this neck of the woods too, by the way, and Darlene and I, Rob, are threatening to get up that way of course, the pandemic put a kibosh on everything, but we're threatening to come up that way perhaps next year and finally get to walk this ground.
No,
But
absolutely. I'd love to take you up on that threat.
yeah, I had eyes and ears on the ground at Rhode Island in the same way I had eyes and ears on the ground at White Plains. I gave Phil a shout out for being my leg man at White Plains and for doing really journeyman's duty in the resources, both written and physical resources, to help me ensure that I was correct. In the same respect, Rob Doan, he jogs. Can you scroll up to Cards Readout? There, yeah, Cards Readout is right there.
Mm-hmm.
And we were a little bit unsure about exactly where to put some of these slopes, and Rob just flatly told me, I jog up that hill, every day or every other day. I can tell you there's a slope there. It's that kind of firsthand on the ground experience that is invaluable, not only for the primary locations, the historical sites like a redoubt or a given church or a given historical marker, but just for the overall lay of the land. Can you see a hilltop from another hilltop, or is that beyond the pale? Does that creek really run that far? What about historically? Was there woods there or not? So it's a matter of historical maps, and then on the ground, invaluable site research, walking the terrain. And I was blessed to have both Rob and Phil collaborate with me on these last two in that respect.
Yeah, Andy, I can tell you the maps that I think made the most difference for us in Rhode Island here came from the Rhode Island Historical Society, and then there's a great collection of historical maps at the Clements Library at the University of Michigan. They have a great collection for early 17th and 18th century maps. So that's a great resource. I don't know if those have been used for other games in the series, but they both came in handy for this one.
For certain, there's a lot of period maps that are just gorgeous cartographic representations in their own right, and I think you can really see the impact in the artwork here. And certainly, Mark, when you make it out to Newport, I think if you know what you're looking for, you can certainly find a lot of the areas, and some of the hills have markers and preservations. Turkey Hill, I was able to tour that area, but it's not nearly as well preserved as, of course, many of us would like it to be. That's, I think, a struggle for a lot of battlefields, certainly.
Yeah. If I may share an anecdote, Phil, when we were working on White Plains, Phil sent me lots of pictures. Again, he was out on most weekends with his family and taking snapshots of this, that, and the other thing. Well, where the village of White Plains and the village of North Castle Heights meet, there was a majestic oak tree. And that's where the earliest settlers to White Plains struck their treaty with the indigenous people to acquire the land in and around White Plains. And it was ever after known as the treaty oak. And there's pictures of it in period books and so forth. And I mean majestic. I mean, like under the spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. I mean, it was one of those huge trees with wonderful boughs. And he sent me a picture. And the great treaty oak is today no more than a black steel pipe with what amounts to a street sign on top that says treaty oak, or site of the treaty oak, if you will. And it's indiscriminately nondescriptly placed in the middle of a strip mall with a dry cleaner and a gas station. And if you didn't absolutely know to look for it, you'd never see it. You'd blow right by it. And, it's not even commemorated other than that the pole is there. And, that's, I think, an extreme example of what becomes of so much of our heritage. And that's why I think, part of my motivation, as I said last night on GMT night, was to do these games to bring this history, this all important history of our founding, to light, in addition to creating a challenging, fun, balanced, war game, but to do it in a way that puts you there and lets you experience the history to the best of my ability anyway. Any other questions, guys? Well, I've kept you 25, if not 30 minutes over time, but I've enjoyed every single minute. Rob, I can't thank you enough for being my co-pilot. I'd have been lost without you. And thanks one and all for joining in, and thanks for your support of the series. I hope to see you on ConSim or at PresCon in the RevCon room, or perhaps at WBC, or just, hey, for a pickup game of one of these games on Vassal. I'm certainly at your service to play almost any time. So thank you all once again, and with that, I'm going to sign off.